The figure known in historical records as Pablo Escobar first saw the light of day on December 1st, 1949, born as Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria in Rio Negro, a city within the Antioquia province of Colombia. His father, Abel de Jesus Dari Escobar Echeverri, was a humble farmer who often found himself working as a farm laborer on other people's land to provide for his large family, which consisted of 7 children, with Pablo being the third. Pablo's mother, Hermilda de los Dolores Gaviria Berrio, juggled the responsibilities of raising their 7 children while also working as a teacher in the local elementary school. Although his birthplace was Rio Negro, the family relocated to Medellín while Pablo was still quite young. It's worth considering the development of this Colombian city, which would become inextricably linked to Pablo's story. The Spanish first established a settlement there in the 1610s, overseeing the development of a racially mixed village. Over the next 2 centuries, it experienced steady growth, so much so that when the Republic of Gran Colombia, encompassing modern-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama, declared independence from Spain in 1819, Medellín was already a regional capital in northwestern Colombia, situated in the Aburrá Valley near the Andes Mountains. As Latin America experienced economic and demographic growth in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, so did Medellín. The population surged from approximately 60,000 people in 1905 to over 300,000 by the time Pablo was born, fueled by Medellín's emergence as an industrial hub. And this expansion didn't stop there. By the time Pablo reached his early 20s, the city's population had surpassed 1 million. Medellín had become the industrial capital of the country and its second largest city. Simultaneously, he became involved in the rampant criminal activities that had sprung up throughout Medellín amidst the prevailing urban poverty. By the age of 14, he was enmeshed in a gang, and he was soon expelled from school. He was also implicated in several incidents with fellow gang members. One such incident involved a fight with Julio Tulio Garces, which he lost, but Pablo remained undeterred. The next time he found himself in an altercation, this time with a certain Julio Gaviria, Pablo brandished a firearm and shot him in the foot. This incident was reported to the police, leading to Pablo spending his first few nights in a Colombian prison. Furthermore, he and several of his friends were involved in various petty crimes during their teenage years. Some accounts suggest they stole gravestones, sanded off the inscriptions, and resold them as new. Others claim Pablo ran a scheme to sell fake high school and university diplomas. It's difficult to distinguish fact from fiction in these accounts of his early life. The subsequent turbulent life of Pablo Escobar must be considered in the context of Colombia's history in the 20th century and the growth of the drug trade there. In some ways, politics and narcotics are inseparable in modern Colombia. The country's politics has been dominated by liberal and conservative factions and has consistently faced scrutiny and interference from the United States of America. Initially, this interventionism replicated elsewhere in Latin America as a result of the Monroe Doctrine, which considered the Americas as a U.S. sphere of influence, focused on American access to the Isthmus of Panama. However, once Panama seceded from Colombia in the early 20th century, this concern diminished. Often, conservative politicians would align with American business interests, seeking to control the trade in coffee, bananas, and other products throughout Central and South America. This resulted in a country with a lagging economy and widespread poverty. However, shortly before Pablo's birth, the country entered a period of populist rule as the liberal faction sought to alleviate the country's economic woes and redistribute Colombia's wealth more equitably. Modern Colombia's political instability can largely be traced to 1948, the year before Pablo was born, when the populist politician Jorge Eliezer Gaitan was assassinated, causing a major rift between the liberals and conservatives. A decade of civil war, known as La Violencia, or the violence, ensued, claiming over 200,000 lives countrywide. Before the two groups agreed to form an uneasy coalition, where the two parties would hold power alternately within the framework of a national front. With covert support and encouragement from the United States, This new government began cracking down on more left-leaning elements within Colombia's politics, particularly Leninist Marxist communist groups, to prevent Colombia from becoming a Russian ally in the Americas, much like Cuba had recently. Starting in 1964, this led to the outbreak of a guerrilla war, which has persisted in various forms to the present day, between the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC, and the Colombian government. Other paramilitary organizations operating in rural Colombia also became involved in the so-called Colombian conflict. The FARC and other groups soon effectively controlled large parts of rural Colombia. All of this occurred as global demand for illegal narcotics, particularly in the United States and Europe, surged in the 1960s and into the 1970s. Initially, marijuana was the drug of choice. But increasingly, the real profits in producing and transporting narcotics into America came from cocaine, the refined and processed powder derived from coca plant leaves. Colombia's environment is ideal for coca plant cultivation, and the country's sprawling rural jungles and increasing lawlessness in the 1960s quickly made it the global center of cocaine production. While organizations like the FARC were not initially directly involved in cocaine production and exportation, they allowed such activities in the territories they controlled in Colombia and taxed the producers, a vital income source for their ability to sustain their civil war against the government by buying arms and other supplies. Later, the FARC and other groups would even engage in production themselves. Therefore, cocaine production in Colombia during Pablo's rise and peak cannot be separated from the country's political circumstances in the latter half of the 20th century. This was the world Pablo Escobar entered in the late 1960s. By the time he was in his late teens, the man who would later proclaim himself a decent man who exports flowers was already involved in organized crime, albeit at a low level in Medellín. Working with Oscar Benel Aguirre, he sold contraband cigarettes and engaged in grand theft auto. The pair and their associates also carried out several high-profile kidnappings and collected large sums of money as ransoms. Escobar was even more ambitious. He wanted to become rich quickly and was willing to engage in any crime to acquire money. By the early 1970s, this included smuggling marijuana, and it was only a matter of switching the cargo to cocaine later on. As a result, many saw him as a marked man. When Pablo met and began courting Maria Victoria Henao, who was a teenager, around this time, her mother reportedly warned her to forget about him unless she was willing to spend much of her life visiting him in prison. Maria remained undeterred, and they eventually married in 1976 when he was 26, and she was just 15. They would have 2 children, Juan and Manuela. It was in the mid-1970s, shortly before his marriage to Maria, that Pablo first became involved in the growing cocaine trade, brought into the business by another smuggler named Griselda Blanco. Cocaine had been something of a niche drug in the United States in the 1960s, with other narcotics like marijuana, LSD, and heroin proliferating to a much greater extent. However, in the 1970s, cocaine use exploded across the country, particularly as the disco scene in cities like New York and Miami expanded. Consequently, the market for cocaine in Latin America, particularly Colombia, expanded exponentially. This situation allowed drug cartels and small operators like Pablo to enter the business in Colombia in the mid-1970s. His initial involvement was with established smugglers in Medellín, who hired Pablo to deliver consignments of coca paste to processing facilities around Medellín and the wider area for conversion into powdered cocaine. Before long, Pablo was cutting out intermediaries and developing his own operations to fly large consignments of fully processed cocaine out of Colombia and into the United States via various routes. Unbeknownst to them at the time, Pablo and his associates had laid the foundation for what would become known as the Medellín cartel. The Medellín cartel almost ended before it truly began. In May 1976, Pablo and several others were arrested en route to Medellín with a large consignment of 18 kilograms of coca paste. Pablo's first instinct was to bribe his arresting officers and, subsequently, the judges in Medellín. When that proved unsuccessful, Pablo attempted to have the arresting officers murdered to prevent them from testifying at his trial. The authorities ultimately decided to drop the case, evidently due to the potential risks now associated with pursuing Escobar. He walked free, but the manner in which he had made the charges disappear was characteristic of Pablo's approach for the next 15 years or so. Escobar was always willing to use violence if it could give him an advantage over his competitors or prevent the authorities from catching up with him. This is crucial to remember when assessing Pablo Escobar. In the years to come, he would continuously attempt to portray himself as a humble drug trader who believed drugs would someday be legalized anyway. But behind this self-serving portrayal was someone who ordered thousands of deaths over the years. Escobar and the Medellín cartel's business exploded in the late 1970s, not only due to the expanding cocaine market in the United States, but also because the cartel developed highly effective methods for importing the drug into America. Shortly after their release from prison in Connecticut in 1976, two mid-level drug smugglers named Carlos Leder, a German-Colombian, and George Jung, an American from Massachusetts, came into Escobar's employ. Leder had been incarcerated in Danbury Prison in Connecticut for smuggling marijuana and selling stolen cars, while Jung had been running an operation to bring marijuana to California from Mexico and then ship it across the country to New England, where it fetched an enormous price compared to its purchase cost. However, at Danbury, they devised a plan to move into the now growing cocaine trade. Consequently, upon their release, they began smuggling cocaine from Colombia through the Caribbean and into America, primarily through Florida and Miami. Initially, Escobar hired the pair to facilitate the expansion of his business by bringing in ever greater cocaine consignments to the United States. But this would soon expand. In 1978, Carlos later began purchasing property on the Bahamian island of Norman's Cay, intending to convert it into a cocaine depot between Colombia and America. In the months that followed, he intimidated local landowners into selling their properties, even murdering some residents. Later, a paranoid and volatile figure also largely pushed Jung out of the operation at this time. Within a few months, he had virtually converted the island into a personal fiefdom and invested millions of dollars to build a runway and warehouses. For the next several years, Norman's Cay served as the Medellín cartel's private airport in the Caribbean, off the coast of the United States and in close proximity to the world's largest cocaine market. Large aircraft would bring in huge consignments of Escobar's cocaine to the island, where it would be offloaded and reloaded onto smaller aircraft that could fly into the United States undetected. At the height of activities, over 300 kilograms of cocaine were arriving at Norman's Cay daily, making Escobar and Leder and their associates billionaires. Leder became so wealthy that he twice offered to pay off the Colombian national debt to avoid prosecution for his crimes. Another prominent associate during this time was Barry Seal. Seal was an airline pilot from Baton Rouge in Louisiana. Like Jung, he had first become involved in drug trafficking in the mid-1970s by bringing in marijuana consignments from Mexico. But he, like Jung and Leder, had quickly realized the greater profits in bringing in the more valuable and compact cocaine. By 1981, he had established connections with Escobar and the Medellín cartel and had a systematic operation in place. Seal used over a dozen small aircraft that could fly low and avoid radar detection in American airspace. They would fly over the Gulf of Mexico to Louisiana airspace, where they would drop packages at agreed-upon sites in rural areas. Seal then had a ground team collect the packages before shipping them off towards Florida and delivering them into the Medellín cartel's wider distribution network on the East Coast. However, Seal's work for Escobar became a double-edged sword. He was indicted by the DEA in America in 1983, and by early 1984, he was working as a U.S. government informant, providing extensive information about Escobar and his operation. Escobar eventually discovered this and had Seal killed in February 1986. While Norman's Cay was becoming a private fiefdom for Leder as an offshoot of the Medellín cartel, and Seal was dropping his packages over Louisiana, Escobar was also establishing his own private kingdom in Colombia. With some of the proceeds from his operations, Pablo bought approximately 20 square kilometers of land around Puerto Triunfo, about 150 kilometers east of Medellín. There, he developed the Hacienda Nápoles, or Naples Estate, a vast complex for him and his family. It included a Spanish colonial house, a sculpture park, and even a zoo complete with exotic animals that Escobar had imported into Colombia, including zebras, hippos, antelopes, elephants, giraffes, ostriches, and ponies. Escobar was particularly fond of hippos, and many were brought into the hacienda, a decision that has led to a population of wild and feral hippos inhabiting this part of Colombia to this day. Pablo Escobar also amassed a large collection of vintage and luxury cars and motorcycles, and even installed a kart racing track and a bull ring. There was also an airport at the hacienda, though this was for visitors rather than being part of the Medellín cartel's business operations. Escobar had even intended to construct an ancient Greek-style citadel or acropolis here, but this plan ultimately went unrealized. Nor was this the only major property Pablo acquired. Incredibly, despite his status as one of the biggest cocaine importers into the United States, he was able to acquire a massive pink-colored mansion on Miami Beach in Florida in the late 1970s, registered in his own name. This was possible because Escobar was not yet a notorious drug lord at the time, although the US government seized the property in subsequent years. Elsewhere, Escobar acquired a vast estate in the Caribbean on Isla Grande, the Great Island. This is the largest of the islands that make up the Islas del Rosario, a significant archipelago just over 20 miles off the north coast of Colombia. As with the Hacienda Nápoles, Escobar developed a grand estate here, complete with a mansion, additional apartments, imported animals, swimming pools, and a helicopter landing pad for easy access. These were just the most extravagant of the Escobar properties acquired with the illicit gains from the Colombian drug trade, as the Medellín cartel also had hundreds of properties throughout the country, often used solely to hide its money in highly elaborate ways. Pablo's operations continued to grow unhindered throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. At this stage, he benefited from his relative anonymity compared to his later infamy as the king of cocaine or El Patron, the boss. As a result, the Medellín cartel, which he headed, continued to grow exponentially, delivering more and more cocaine into the United States and smuggling significant quantities into other countries like Spain, which served as an entry point for the European drug market, much like Florida did for the American market. The methods used to move the drugs became ever more elaborate, including boats towing small submarines loaded with the powder. Soon, Escobar's operation was responsible for smuggling several tons of cocaine into America and Europe every week, resulting in profits as high as $60 million per day and upwards of $20 billion annually. Consequently, operations expanded beyond Colombia, and by the early 1980s, the cartel was acquiring coca paste from plantations established in neighboring countries like Peru and Bolivia. The operation had created an industry throughout South America. The cartel was now generating so much money that it couldn't be spent, and even laundering and hiding it had become highly problematic. Much of it was laundered through Panama, often by buying gold and melting it down into forms that could then be converted into clean money in other countries. But even these methods had their limitations. So, instead of spending the money, huge amounts were hidden in properties across the country, where few would suspect its presence. Incredibly, the cartel acquired a mansion with a retractable jacuzzi installed. Underneath it was a secret compartment where tens of millions of dollars were stored. A poor Colombian family was given the house to live in without being told about the compartment, the only condition being that they occasionally had to leave the premises whenever money was taken from or added to the compartment. Unsurprisingly, some of this money is still being found today. In 2020, Nicolas Escobar, Pablo's nephew, found $18 million hidden in the wall of one of Pablo's former residences. It is far from the only time huge sums of money have been discovered inadvertently in some of Escobar's and the cartel's former properties. With ever-increasing profits came an ever greater risk of being caught. One of Escobar's and the cartel's greatest fears was extradition. In September 1979, the Colombian government signed an extradition treaty with the administration of U.S. President Jimmy Carter, allowing Colombian drug smugglers who imported large quantities of cocaine into the United States to be sent to the U.S. to face criminal prosecution. This treaty took effect in March 1982 and posed a grave risk to Escobar. If arrested and sentenced in Colombia, the country's prevailing corruption would allow him to either escape conviction or serve a jail sentence under very comfortable terms. However, if he was extradited to the United States and convicted there, he would almost certainly face life in prison in a maximum security facility. In response to this threat, in the early to mid-1980s, Escobar and several associates began a terrorist campaign of kidnappings, murders, and bombings targeting individuals within Colombian politics, policing, and the judiciary to make them repeal the extradition treaty. But it didn't have the desired effect, and throughout the 1980s, the fear of extradition remained omnipresent for traffickers like Escobar in Colombia. To counteract the risk of extradition, Pablo attempted to gain popular support throughout Colombia. Much of Escobar's mystique stemmed from a self-created image as a Colombian Robin Hood. In the early years, there was a perception that Pablo and the cartel's activities did little to harm ordinary Colombians. Any social damage caused by their actions occurred far away in the United States, a country that many Colombians viewed as an imperial aggressor in Latin America. To further soften his image, Pablo gave away substantial amounts of the vast sums flowing into the cartel's coffers every week. He distributed free cash to the people of Medellín in some instances, and spent large sums of money on building projects in Medellín and the wider country. These included soccer stadiums, parks, and civic amenities. For a time, he even opened the zoo at Hacienda Nápoles to the public, charging no entry fee. One of the most significant investments was improving the road network around Medellín. The city had developed rapidly in the 20th century and was now plagued by traffic jams, which Pablo's money helped alleviate. Finally, at Christmas, Escobar dressed as Santa Claus and gave out expensive presents in poorer neighborhoods. In this way, he bought the adulation of many of Medellín's and wider Colombia's citizens. Despite such efforts to soften his image, by the early 1980s, Pablo was well known as the head of the infamous Medellín cartel and a marked man. So, he responded in a novel way. He courted even further notoriety. In 1982, he decided to enter Colombian politics and stood as a candidate for the Colombian Liberal Party. Here, he focused his campaign on the extradition treaty just coming into effect between Colombia and the United States, arguing that the Colombian president, Julio César Iturbé, was effectively ceding Colombia's sovereignty to the United States by allowing Washington to extradite Colombian citizens to its country and prosecute them there. Yet, Pablo had his critics throughout the campaign, some of whom were silenced with bullets. At a debate in Medellín, one vocal dissenter accused Escobar of entering politics for his own ends. The man was detained by the Medellín police shortly afterward, some of whom were in the cartel's employ. He was then handed over to Escobar's henchmen before turning up days later dead on the streets of Medellín, his body riddled with bullets. Thus, through a mixture of intimidation and populism, Escobar managed to win election to the Colombian Chamber of Representatives in March 1982. Pablo's entry into Colombian politics was a debatable strategy. While it provided a smokescreen for his illicit activities and allowed him to challenge the extradition treaty from within Parliament, it drew an awful lot of unnecessary attention to him. More significantly, it provoked the conservative political establishment in Colombia to begin attempting to bring him down. Before, he had been one of many drug traffickers in the country, albeit the most successful. Now, he was deliberately trying to undermine the country's political establishment. In particular, the newly elected conservative president, Belisario Betancourt, was determined to oust Escobar from Colombia's politics. To that end, in the summer of 1983, Betancourt initiated a campaign against Pablo. Firstly, He appointed Rodrigo Lara Bonilla as the Minister of Justice to take a much more active stance in prosecuting Colombia's drug traffickers, with Pablo being chief among them. Simultaneously, a media campaign was launched against Escobar, with a lengthy article appearing in the El Espectador newspaper assessing Pablo's earlier arrest in 1976. This provided extensive details of what had happened and Escobar's subsequent efforts to cover up his arrest and the methods used to avoid prosecution. Pablo was now the subject of unwanted media scrutiny as he became the face of illegal drug trafficking in Colombia. His initial reaction was his usual one to such unwanted attention. He contemplated ordering the murder of El Espectador's editor, while also directing cartel members to purchase as many copies of the newspaper as possible to restrict its readership. However, within days, further stories began to emerge, extending the issue beyond the pages of El Espectador. Some of these stories centered on his private life, detailing how Pablo had begun an affair with a prominent Colombian television presenter named Virginia Vallejo. Vallejo had recently become the first journalist to conduct a one-on-one interview with Escobar, and their relationship had evolved from there. The result was a crisis both at home and in public for the trafficker, as his wife, Maria, temporarily evicted him from the family home and threatened divorce, a situation only resolved after much pleading. Despite this, Pablo's affair with Vallejo continued on and off for several more years, only ending in 1987. Pablo was now attracting excessive attention, and in late 1983, the superior judge of Medellín, Gustavo Zuluaga, decided to reopen the investigation into Pablo's arrest in 1976. Simultaneously, the United States Embassy in Bogotá revoked Escobar's American visa, while the Colombian Congress voted to revoke Pablo's special immunity as a member of parliament. As a result, he decided to step back from the political arena, realizing that his plan to acquire greater protection from prosecution by entering politics had backfired. On January 20th, 1984, he resigned his seat in the Colombian Chamber of Representatives, stating in a letter, "I will continue to fight against oligarchies and injustices and against backroom deal-making, which continues to nurture a blatant disregard for the people's needs, and especially against demagogues and dirty politicians who remain indolent in the face of the people's suffering, but are always on the alert when it comes to divvying up official power." It was a defiant exit, and as the years ahead would demonstrate, Escobar was now determined to confront the Colombian government in other, more aggressive ways. On April 30th, 1984, 3 months after Pablo's resignation from the Colombian parliament, the Justice Minister, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, who had made it his goal to prosecute Escobar and Colombia's other main traffickers, was sitting in his car, in traffic, in the streets of Bogotá, when a Yamaha motorcycle pulled up next to the vehicle. There were 2 men on it. One was driving, but the back passenger, Ivan Dario Guisado, quickly pulled out an Uzi submachine gun and opened fire on Bonilla's car. The Justice Minister was struck by multiple bullets and died instantly. Guisado, who was killed moments later as Bonilla's bodyguards returned fire, and the driver, Byron Velasquez, had acted on Escobar's orders, an act effectively declaring war by Pablo on the Colombian government. The authorities viewed it as such and moved to fully implement the extradition treaty with the United States. Meanwhile, Pablo temporarily left Colombia with his family, settling in Panama to the north, and then spending a brief interval in Nicaragua, a country enduring a full-blown civil war in the mid-1880s. When he finally returned to Colombia in late 1984, Pablo was determined to escalate his conflict with the government. He now opened contacts with the 19th of April movement, or M19, a Colombian guerrilla organization that had emerged in the 1970s and become the second largest paramilitary organization in Colombia, next to the FARC. With Pablo's encouragement and financial and logistical support, M19 began preparing to attack the Colombian government head-on in response to the implementation of the extradition treaty with the United States, a development that the group saw as a blatant infringement of Colombia's national sovereignty. On November 6, 1985, Some 36 M19 guerrilla fighters stormed the Palace of Justice, the seat of the Colombian Supreme Court in Bogotá, taking over 300 individuals hostage, including most of the Supreme Court judges. They then issued demands calling for the renunciation of the extradition treaty and for President Betancourt to step down and face charges. Meanwhile, the Colombian army had surrounded the palace and was preparing to storm the building if needed. Pablo had instigated a full-blown military conflict in the center of the Colombian capital, while the M19 fighters' demands in the Palace of Justice could not be granted on any level. On the morning of November 7th, the day after the attack began, there seemed to be room for negotiation. The paramilitary fighters within agreed to release a prominent hostage, a state councilor named Reynaldo Arciniegas, early that morning. But in the hours that followed, the mood soured. Then, just after lunchtime at 2 p.m., General Jesus Armando Arias Cabrales, the commander of the army divisions outside, ordered the storming of the building. In the hours that followed, nearly 100 people were killed inside the palace, including nearly all of the M19 fighters and half of the 24 justices of the Colombian Supreme Court. However, for Pablo, the incident provided an unexpected benefit. Large amounts of documentation and evidence on Colombia's leading traffickers were destroyed in the attack on the palace. It was believed that the M19 fighters within had deliberately burned these to aid Escobar in escaping charges. But it now seems more likely that they were accidentally destroyed by a fire that broke out due to the explosives used by the army to break into the building. The bloodbath had proven unexpectedly beneficial for the drug lord, and meanwhile, Betancourt's government was coming under sustained criticism for its handling of the incident, which had led to the death of half of Colombia's senior judges and dozens of others. In the aftermath of the attack on the Palace of Justice, Colombia's politics began to shift in ways that would have implications for Escobar, his family, the Medellín cartel, and drug traffickers throughout Colombia. Betancourt was badly damaged by the handling of the siege, and in August 1986, Virgilio Barco won a comfortable election victory to replace him as Colombia's 27th president. The Barco government adopted an even tougher stance against Escobar and the cartels than Betancourt's. An indication of this was given in January 1987, months after coming into office, when police units intercepted a convoy of Escobar's cars and jeeps moving from Hacienda Nápoles to a safe house in Medellín. Pablo was traveling separately from his wife and children, so he was not apprehended. But Maria and the children, Juan and Manuela, were arrested and held in a cell for several hours until Pablo's lawyers secured their release. It indicated the new government's willingness to strike at Escobar in any way they could, and was symptomatic of the intensifying conflict between the trafficker and the Colombian government. The Colombian government was not Escobar's only antagonist in the mid to late 1980s. In the late 1970s, just as the Medellín cartel was developing under Pablo's auspices, a separate cartel had emerged in the city of Cali in southwestern Colombia, run by the Orejuela brothers, Gilberto and Miguel, José Londono, and Helmer Pacho Herrera. Initially, the two cartels collaborated, often acting in shared interest to circumvent legal problems in Colombia and launder their money abroad. Agreements were put in place to divide certain parts of the cocaine market within the United States. However, tensions escalated in the mid-1980s, in part due to efforts by Rodriguez Gacha, one of the senior members of the Medellín cartel, to muscle his way into the New York City market, an area that Medellín had typically ceded to Cali. By late 1987, an open war was in effect between Medellín and Cali, with rampant murders and numerous bombings. One of the latter in 1988 even succeeded in detonating a car bomb outside Escobar's house. All of this added to the array of problems facing Escobar in the late 1980s, and the war with the Cali cartel would continue in varying levels of intensity for the remainder of Pablo's life. Despite the war with Cali and the government's ongoing efforts to arrest or extradite him, the Medellín cartel reached the peak of its wealth and power in the mid to late 1980s, fueled by the ever-increasing demand for cocaine in the United States. By this stage, the cartel was generating revenues of approximately $70 million per day, or about $25 billion annually, a sum that would amount to over $70 billion in today's money when adjusted for inflation. All the result of a trafficking network that managed to import over a dozen tons of cocaine on average into the US daily. As later recounted by Pablo's brother Roberto, who oversaw much of the cartel's finances and logistics, the organization was spending $1,000 a week on rubber bands to divide the incoming money into stacks. There was so much profit that perhaps as much as 10% of the cartel's money was being lost or destroyed before it could ever be spent. The cartel controlled approximately 80% of the world's cocaine trade at this time, and Pablo himself was estimated to be one of the world's wealthiest billionaires. Though estimates of his actual accumulated wealth vary considerably, Pablo continued to use this money to buoy up his reputation within Colombia. In particular, Escobar was aware of the value of using sport for his own propaganda purposes. Beginning in the early 1980s, he had begun offering extensive financial support to Medellín's football team, Atlético Nacional. In a few short years, the club transformed from a mid-table performer in the Colombian National League to title contenders. Foreign players were brought in on high-paying contracts, and some of Colombia's best footballers played there in the 1980s. The club finished second in the championship in 1988, qualifying them for the Copa Libertadores, the Pan-South American Football Cup in 1989, progressing to the final. Nacional beat Paraguay's Club Olimpia in a penalty shootout to become the first Colombian team to win the Copa. For Pablo, investment in the club had multiple benefits. It won him huge numbers of supporters in Medellín and Colombia more broadly, and allowed him to launder significant sums of money through betting rings. Eventually, even this avenue of business was closed, as the footballing authorities began to crack down on the cartel's influence in Colombian football. For instance, Colombian teams were banned from the Copa Libertadores for a time in the early 1990s. Whatever the vagaries of the cartel's wealth and the sporting success of Atlético Nacional, Escobar's trafficking operations had a frightening impact on Medellín itself. By the end of the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Medellín had become statistically the most dangerous city on earth, measured by violent incidents and homicides committed. In 1991 alone, there were 7,237 murders in the city, an average of about 18 homicides per day, or a rate of 266 people out of every 100,000 people each year. The city's population had expanded significantly again to more than 1.5 million people. More broadly, Colombia, plagued by the government's clashes with the FARC and other guerrillas and the wars and conflicts between the various cartels, had become the most dangerous country in the world. In 1991, there were over 25,000 violent deaths recorded, increasing to over 27,000 in 1992. This was an average of 70 violent deaths per day, or about one person every 20 minutes. According to most standard measurements, Colombia was effectively a failed state by the late 1980s and early 1990s, a development largely owing to Escobar's and the Medellín cartel's activities. It was not simply that Escobar's trafficking activity and Colombia's wider political problems caused all this bloodshed. Pablo was also capable of engaging in acts of indiscriminate mass murder. Some of the most notorious incidents came in the early winter of 1989. On November 27th, Avianca Flight 203, a Colombian domestic passenger flight from Bogotá to Cali, exploded in the sky 5 minutes after taking off from the Colombian capital, killing all 107 passengers and 3 others on the ground. Pablo had orchestrated the bombing leading up to the 1990 presidential election in a failed effort to kill César Gaviria Trujillo, a candidate whom it was clear would take a tough stance on the cartels if elected. Then, just 2 weeks later, a truck bomb exploded outside the Administrative Department of Security building in Bogotá. On this occasion, Escobar's target was General Miguel Alfredo Márquez, the director of the department. The truck had been filled with half a ton of dynamite, and the explosion was so big that it killed 57 people and injured over 2,000 in the building and the surrounding area. Thus, despite his efforts to portray himself as a Colombian Robin Hood, Escobar was overseeing acts of indiscriminate mass murder throughout Colombia in the late 1980s. Escobar's efforts to assassinate Cesar Gaviria Trujillo had been foiled in November 1989 because the contender for the office of President of Colombia had not boarded Avianca Flight 203. Trujillo had emerged as a candidate following the assassination of Luis Carlos Galan. Galan was a long-standing nemesis of Escobar who had decided to run for the presidency in 1990. By August 1989, he was well ahead in the national polls. But on the 18th of that month, he was gunned down in Soacha in the outskirts of Bogotá. There is no doubt that Escobar had ordered his assassination. Trujillo had stepped into the void created by Galan's assassination. And there was no doubt that Pablo had to be prosecuted to the fullest extent possible by the new Colombian government when Trujillo duly won the election to become president in 1990. However, months later, a new obstacle was introduced when a new constitution was promulgated for Colombia in 1991, with the stipulation that it would not honor the extradition treaty with the United States. Many contemporaries and most analysts since have concluded that a broad range of individuals connected to the cartels, and Escobar most especially, had bribed dozens of members of the National Assembly to ensure that the extradition treaty was not included in the new constitution. With the fear of extradition to the United States temporarily removed and the difficulties of his position mounting, a situation in which he was simultaneously at war with the Cali cartel and the Colombian government, Pablo now decided on another radically different course of action. He began to negotiate with elements within Trujillo's administration about how he could offer to serve a limited jail sentence to bring to an end his conflict with the state and make himself a relatively free man at the end of the process. This arrangement could have benefits for both sides. For Escobar, it would mean a relatively clean slate within Colombia, while for the Colombian government, it offered the possibility that the constant attacks on politicians and judges Escobar had overseen for the better part of a decade might finally end. It would not be the most honorable of deals, but for a country mired in so many problems by the early 1990s, including a civil war in the rural parts of the country, it presented the possibility of temporarily abating one problem. As a result, in 1991, Pablo Escobar, the head of the Medellín cartel, voluntarily surrendered himself to Colombian law enforcement. There was just one catch. He had requested that he be allowed to build his own jail. La Catedral, or the cathedral, was not precisely the typical idea of a prison, where in many jurisdictions prisons are built to separate the incarcerated individual from their old life. Escobar was able to negotiate the terms of his surrender, including the ability to build his own prison. The cathedral was constructed on a hilltop overlooking Medellín, so that Pablo's associates and family could easily visit him. The setup was not particularly onerous for the Colombian drug lord. The prison featured a football pitch, a jacuzzi, and even its own bar, replete with a waterfall. Escobar had his private telephone line and a telescope set up so he could get a bird's-eye view of what was occurring in the city below. Effectively, this was a purpose-built mansion for Escobar, where he was under voluntary house arrest. The prison became known colloquially as Hotel Escobar, to indicate how lax the terms of Pablo's prison sentence actually were. Moreover, it was constructed with defense in mind. Built on a hilltop often shrouded in fog, the cathedral acted more as a fortress to prevent anyone outside from getting to Escobar, rather than a prison confining Pablo. The terms of Pablo's sentence were that he would spend no more than 5 years imprisoned at La Catedral, and the Colombian government had agreed to forego any efforts to extradite him to the United States. Escobar would effectively be allowed to continue overseeing his trafficking activities from atop the hill overlooking Medellín, while the government would be able to save face and say it had finally imposed some form of punishment on the drug lord. However, the subterfuge did not last very long. By early 1992, reports were circulating in the Colombian media that Pablo was effectively continuing to run the Medellín cartel from La Catedral, as well as exposés of the comfortable surroundings he enjoyed there. Under pressure, the Colombian government decided to move Escobar to a more conventional Colombian jail in July 1992. Word of this easily reached Pablo in advance at the Hilltop prison, and with few genuine restrictions on his movements, Escobar was able to leave La Catedral unhindered. A false wall built over an escape tunnel was removed, and Escobar could easily leave through an escape route installed when his prison was built to house him. Pablo's flight from La Catedral ushered in the last dramatic episode of his life. He had escaped being sent to a tougher prison, but was now firmly opposed by Trujillo's government, entirely willing to call on the United States and allow American secret services to operate freely on Colombian soil, to apprehend, detain, or kill Escobar. By the early 1990s, a division of the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command, commonly known as SEAL Team 6, was operating in Colombia with the express purpose of apprehending Escobar and, if possible, extraditing him to the United States, where he would certainly face a life sentence in a maximum security prison. These were joined and aided by Search Block, a special operations unit of the National Police of Colombia, assembled as early as 1986 by the Barco administration, but given additional resources in the early 1990s as the drive to apprehend Escobar intensified. They were also joined by a broad coalition of Escobar's other enemies, notably the Cali cartel and a vigilante group known as Los Pepes, an organization ostensibly representing people who had lost loved ones because of Escobar's campaign of violence and bombings since the 1980s. The U.S. and Colombian special forces collaborated with Los Pepes after Escobar's flight from La Catedral. The manhunt commenced as soon as Escobar fled the prison in July 1992. Pablo immediately inflamed the situation by giving an interview with a local radio station as soon as he had established himself at a safe house. In this, he taunted the government and his opponents by outlining details of how he had escaped. Still, there was an element of caution. Escobar made it clear that he was willing to come back into custody if certain conditions could be met, specifically that he would be allowed to serve out the remainder of the agreed sentence at La Catedral. But the government had had enough. No new terms were offered, and the manhunt was stepped up. The collaboration between Search Block and the American Delta Force and Special Operations units was openly seen on the streets of Medellín and Bogotá, as units made house-to-house searches and attempted to track down Escobar's closest associates. In December 1992, they came close to apprehending the drug lord when they raided a safe house he was using. Pablo had only moved from it hours earlier, but progress was being made in other ways as many of Escobar's supporters and facilitators began to turn their backs on an individual they now saw as doomed to be apprehended eventually, and as the price of remaining loyal became ever higher. A clear indication of these shifting fortunes was seen when Pablo's brother-in-law was killed by Los Pepes. In the end, Escobar managed to evade the authorities for nearly a year and a half after his flight from La Catedral. He was finally caught owing to a surveillance operation that traced his cell phone transmissions in the early winter of 1993. As a result, Search Block and U.S. operatives determined that Escobar was holed up in another safe house in Los Olivos, a middle-class neighborhood in Medellín. They moved on December 2, 1993. A unit of 8 burst through the door, after which Escobar and his bodyguard that day, Álvaro de Jesús Agudelo, or El Limón, ran onto the roof of the building and attempted to escape across the roofs of the adjoining houses. It is not 100% clear what happened next. Gunfire was exchanged, and moments later, Pablo was lying dead on the rooftop, bullets having hit him in his leg, torso, and ear. The shot to the ear entered his head and killed him. But there is a suspicion that Escobar delivered this bullet himself, having determined sometime earlier that he would commit suicide before facing the possibility of being extradited to the United States. Pablo's brother and close confidant, Roberto, later claimed Pablo had always asserted he would shoot himself through the ear if cornered. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. On December 2, 1993, just one day after his 44th birthday and 17 years after the emergence of the Medellín cartel, the man known as El Patrón, the boss, was killed in Medellín. Despite the violence he had unleashed, The Robin Hood image Escobar had cultivated for himself remained strong. Over 25,000 mourners turned out for his funeral. After Escobar's death, the Cali cartel moved for a time to become the biggest manufacturer and trafficker of cocaine in Colombia. However, it faced stiff competition from a new organization, the Norte del Valle Cartel, or North Valley Cartel, which had first emerged in the final years of Pablo's life in the Valle del Cauca region. Both outfits increasingly looked to transport their cocaine north to Mexico, which became the new entry point into the United States as the Caribbean routes to Florida and the East Coast became ever more difficult to traffic through in the 1990s. Eventually, the Cali cartel was largely dismantled and fragmented in the mid-1990s, and further successor syndicates appeared, notably the North Coast Cartel, based out of the northern city of Barranquilla and focused on supplying networks east to Europe, while also rejuvenating some of Pablo's older supply lines north to the East Coast cities of the United States. All of these others have come and gone and been replaced by newer organizations, each determined to use ever more violent methods to establish themselves. Today, Colombia is gradually recovering from the drug cartels and the political conflicts that ripped it apart in the second half of the 20th century and allowed figures such as Escobar to flourish. In 2016, a historic ceasefire agreement was introduced between the Colombian government and the FARC rebels, offering the possibility of ending half a century of paramilitary violence in the country. Medellín has prospered since Escobar's demise. Crime rates in the city decreased rapidly after the collapse of the Medellín cartel in the mid-1990s, and the city has benefited from investment and the development of major transport infrastructure, which has seen it become a hub of industry and business within Colombia once again in the early 21st century. The city is internationally acclaimed for its development of an environmental and innovative public transport system, a far cry from its position 30 years ago as the homicide capital of the world under Escobar's auspices. Other signs of Escobar's influence are still visible. La Catedral was left abandoned for many years in the late 1990s and early 2000s, but in 2007, a group of Benedictine monks took it over and turned it into a religious site, complete with a library and other amenities. Meanwhile, the hippos have increased in number and are still wandering around the grounds of the Hacienda Nápoles. Pablo Escobar was an enigmatic figure. He grew up in the urban squalor of Medellín, which had developed from a small town into a city of over 1 million people during the half-century between the 1920s and the 1970s. Furthermore, he rose to prominence as a drug trafficker when Colombia was embroiled in mass political violence, essentially a civil war, and as the country also became the world's leading producer of cocaine. Therefore, it is easy to imagine that if Escobar had not emerged as the head of the Medellín cartel, someone else would have risen to prominence in the Colombian drug trade, whether in Medellín, Cali, or elsewhere. It could also be argued that he did much to help the poor and disenfranchised, particularly in his hometown, at a time when Colombia was suffering from appalling poverty, and many people had effectively been abandoned by the government in Bogotá. Pablo gave handouts to the poor, created jobs, and developed Medellín's infrastructure. He even allowed people free access to his zoo at Hacienda Nápoles and buoyed people's spirits by funding Atlético Nacional football team to such an extent that they won the Copa Libertadores in 1989. This was the Robin Hood-type image that Escobar attempted to cultivate. The reality is far grimmer, though. Escobar was a mass murderer who plunged Colombia and Medellín into unprecedented violence and bloodshed. It is certainly true that the country had many problems not of his making, but his increasingly determined efforts to wage war on the Colombian government and rivals such as the Cali cartel from the mid-1980s onwards saw the country reach a point where over 25,000 violent deaths were occurring every year, nearly one-third of them in Medellín alone. Moreover, Escobar might have been willing to give away much of his wealth, most of which the cartel could not use by the mid to late 1980s anyway. But he was equally willing to murder scores, or even hundreds of innocent bystanders at a time in efforts to kill his enemies, such as occurred with Avianca Flight 203, and the Department of Security bombings in November and December 1989. Once his malevolent influence was removed in the mid-1990s, Medellín and Colombia gradually started to make progress toward reforming the city and the country. Consequently, while Escobar might have claimed he was simply a decent man who sells flowers, the reality was far different. What do you think of Pablo Escobar? Was he the Colombian Robin Hood type figure he tried to portray himself as? Or was he simply a ruthless mass murderer and profiteer? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.